Go ahead and get comfortable. Find your spot. Pull the blanket up a little higher or settle into the chair you always end up in at this hour. Maybe you've got something warm to drink in your hands right now, something that's still steaming just slightly. Maybe the house is quiet around you, that particular nighttime quiet where even the familiar sounds of the building, the hum of something electric, the settling of walls, seem slightly more present than they do during the day. Maybe the rain is doing that soft thing against the window, where it sounds like the whole world has slowed down by about half a step and decided it's willing to stay right here for a while. Good. That's exactly where we want to be. Because what we're about to do tonight isn't quick. That it isn't a highlight reel or a rapid-fire listicle or a 10-minute overview of the stuff you already know. What we're going to do is go somewhere we've been before. And yet somehow, despite all the times we've been there, still haven't fully explored. We're going back to a small town in Oregon that doesn't exist on any map you've ever seen. A place where the trees are too tall and the shadows between them are the wrong shape. Where the sky at dusk goes a shade of purple that isn't quite right for the Pacific Northwest, or for anywhere in this dimension, really. A place where a 12-year-old boy once reached into the hollow roots of an old pine tree and pulled out a book with a six-fingered hand on the cover. And where that single act of discovery pulled an entire summer and an entire mythology that has been growing in the minds of its audience for over a decade into motion. We're going back to Gravity Falls, and we're going to spend the next few hours sitting with the parts of it that nobody has ever fully explained. The pieces that were placed with intention, but never collected. The doors that were built and then never opened from the inside. The questions that the show raised with such precision and care that their lack of answers feels less like an oversight and more like a choice. Here's the first thing you need to understand about Gravity Falls if you want to engage with it at the level this show actually deserves. Most mystery stories, when they reach their conclusion, are designed to satisfy you. The clues come together. The puzzle pieces lock into place. The curtain gets pulled back, the light comes on, and you understand. The mystery was always pointing at something definite, something real, so something that was always going to be there waiting for you at the end of the road. And you feel good. You feel the particular pleasure of completion. Gravity Falls is not that kind of story. Not entirely. Gravity Falls is a show that answers enough of its questions to make you feel the craft of the writing, to make you trust that someone is in control of this mythology, that someone knows what they're doing with all these threads. But it is also, underneath the craft and the care, a show that maintains a deep and deliberate relationship with irreducible mystery. With the things that don't have answers, not because someone forgot to write them, but because some questions, when you sit with them long enough, reveal themselves to be the kind of questions that are more interesting open than closed. That teach you more by sitting with them than they would by resolving. Creator Alex Hirsch spent years planting things in that show. In the dialogue between characters who seem to be having one conversation while actually having another. In the backgrounds of scenes, where symbols appear in the grain of a wall that won't become meaningful for another 18 months of broadcast time. In the coded messages at the end of every single episode, an entire secondary layer of storytelling running parallel to the main narrative, accessible only to viewers willing to learn cryptography in real time. And in the physical and emotional architecture of characters who seem simple on first view and turn out to have been carrying enormous weight the whole time. Most of what he planted means something. Most of it was designed to bloom at a specific moment and does exactly that. Sometimes with a precision that feels almost impossible for a children's cartoon. Sometimes with an emotional impact that hits so cleanly it seems to arrive before you expected it. But then there are the others. The things that were planted and never harvested. The clues that were laid down but that lead somewhere the show never took you. The moments that felt significant in the watching and that still feel significant in memory, but that the show moved past without turning back. Those are the things we're here for tonight. Now, I want to be honest with you about something before we begin, because you deserve to know what kind of expedition this actually is. When we talk about mysteries in the context of Gravity Falls, we're sitting at the intersection of several different categories of unknown. Some of what we'll talk about tonight are things the show deliberately left open, moments of genuine narrative ambiguity designed by Hirsch and his team to spark thought and conversation, rather than deliver a resolution. These are the intentional mysteries. Some are threads that feel real because they are real. Things that were genuinely part of the show's development, directions that were being explored, stories that were being built. And then time ran out, and those threads were quietly left hanging rather than tied off. And some are questions the fandom has been examining for over a decade. Places where the evidence in the show points unmistakably towards something, but the something itself is never named, never confirmed. Just present in the logic of the world like an object you can see the shadow of, but can't quite turn around to face directly. We're going to move through all of these tonight, slowly without rushing toward conclusions the material doesn't support. Because the worst thing you can do with a show like this is flatten it. The worst thing you can do with a mystery that deserves its mystery is force it toward an answer, just to feel like you've accomplished something. Gravity Falls. First aired on June 15th, 2012 on the Disney Channel. On the surface, on the comfortable, laughing, easily accessible surface that made it beloved by a generation of children who had absolutely no idea what they were watching. It was a summer adventure cartoon. Two 12-year-old twins, a boy named Dipper and his sister Mabel, spending their vacation in a tourist trap called the Mystery Shack with their great-uncle Stan somewhere in the endless conifer forests of Oregon. Monsters showed up. Mysteries got solved. Stan ran scams on tourists. It was funny and warm and immediately beloved. But even in the very first episode, in the very first minute of the very first episode, in the opening credits sequence that aired before anything else, something else was happening. At the end of the theme song, the camera pulls back from a page in a journal to reveal a brief, strobing image. A circular wheel covered in symbols surrounding a triangle with a single eye at its center. The image is there for less than a second. Most viewers register it as atmosphere, as visual style. Except if you paused on that flash and applied a Caesar cipher to the encoded text visible at the bottom of the wheel, shifting each letter back by 3 positions in the alphabet, the simplest possible cipher, the cipher you'd teach a child first, the message revealed itself. And it said, Stan is not what he seems. He planted the answer in the theme song before you knew there was a question. He hid the conclusion inside the opening. Before you knew Stan's name, before you knew there was a portal under the Mystery Shack, before you knew there was a twin brother or a stolen identity, or 30 years of loneliness and devotion being lived out in secret, beneath the surface of every scene where Stan seemed to be doing nothing more than complaining about overhead costs, before any of that, the credits were already telling you. That is Gravity Falls in a single image. The answer inside the question. The mystery wearing the costume of the show's most ordinary moment. And if that's the kind of thing that makes your brain light up, if you are the kind of person who finds genuine delight in the idea that a children's cartoon contained more carefully constructed layers than most prestige adult dramas, then you are exactly where you belong tonight. Let's go slowly. There's a lot to look at. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, I genuinely want to know where you are. Drop a comment below with the time and the place. Whether you're up at 2 in the morning in a city I've never been to, catching this on a slow afternoon somewhere sunny, or listening in the dark with your phone face down on the mattress. I read these. This community is full of people who care about exactly this kind of thing, and hearing from you is the whole point. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, it's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it keeps this channel going. Okay, back to the woods. Section 2. The Journals. What Ford didn't write down. Before we talk about what Ford Pines didn't write down, let's talk about what he did. The journals are not just plot devices. They are the show's primary argument about the value of careful observation. But Ford spent years in Gravity Falls before the show's timeline begins, documenting everything. Every creature, every phenomenon, every anomaly, everything he found underground or in the forest or hovering over the floating cliffs at a specific hour of the morning. He wrote it down. He documented it with drawings and measurements and speculative notes and emotional marginalia that you can see shifting in tone if you read the entries chronologically, from excited and energized in the early entries to increasingly anxious and strange as the Bill years deepen. He did the work of paying attention, and the journals are the physical record of that attention. He made 3 of them. That is the first question. Why 3? The in-universe answer is organizational. They represent different phases of his research, different thematic areas. But 3 also implies that there was always going to be a third, that someone was always going to find the first one in a pine tree and go looking for the others. The number is intentional and structural. It creates a quest. Journal 1 and Journal 2 remained hidden, largely out of circulation, while Journal 3 ended up in the hollow roots of a specific tree where a 12-year-old boy would find it at the exact moment he needed to find it. The tree was in the forest behind the Mystery Shack. The question the show raises but doesn't fully answer. Did it get there naturally, or was it placed? Ford hid it deliberately in his last hours before the portal accident. But why that tree? Why that location, close enough to the shack that Stan's nephews and niece would eventually find it? In a summer? Far enough in the future that Stan would have the portal running by then? Was that coincidence? Was it strategy from someone who knew there would be twins visiting that summer? Was it the axolotl arranging pieces on a board that exists outside normal time? The journals contain the visible text, the descriptions of creatures, the theoretical frameworks, the coded warnings. They also contain the pages that were torn out. Cryptograms decoded over years of fan effort reference things the journals describe without showing. Events in Ford's research that he wrote down and then apparently removed before the journals could be found. Some of those gaps are explained by the book's supplementary editions. Many are not. The journals as physical objects are full of deliberate absence. And the deliberate absence is as much a part of what they are as the text that remains. Every mystery in Gravity Falls circles back, through some combination of plot logic and gravitational pull, to those 3 journals. Journal 1, Journal 2, Journal 3. Each one bound in what looks like old leather, heavy and battered, from years of being hidden and found and handled and feared. Each one stamped on the cover with a golden imprint of a 6-fingered hand. Each one filled with decades of handwriting that shifts between the methodical notations of a scientist recording observations and the increasingly anxious scrawl of a man who has started to understand that the thing he has been building is going to cost him everything if he lets it reach completion. Yet Journal 3 was the one Dipper found in the roots of a pine tree in the very first episode, the one the show spent its first season treating as the primary document of Gravity Falls' strangeness, the field guide to a town full of things that shouldn't exist. Journal 2, which ended up in the possession of Gideon Gleeful, and then eventually in Stan's hands, contained the summoning ritual for Bill Cipher. Journal 1 was the one Ford threw back to Stan during their confrontation at the portal, the one Stan kept hidden for 30 years while he worked in secret. Together, the 3 form a complete, or nearly complete, document of Ford Pine's years in Gravity Falls, mapping his research from the late 1970s through the paranoid, brilliant, increasingly compromised work that culminated in the portal's construction and his disappearance through it. But here's the question that has been sitting quietly at the back of the fandom's mind since nearly the beginning, and that still doesn't have a clean answer. Why 3? Specifically 3, numbered specifically, hidden in specific separate locations around the town, as though the number and the separation both served a purpose beyond simple security. Ford is a methodical researcher, the kind of obsessive who builds a hidden underground laboratory beneath the forest floor and fills it with cryogenic chambers and surveillance equipment before the first season of his research is even complete. The kind of person who developed a notation system detailed enough that specific pages of Journal 3 can be read by blacklight to reveal additional layers of information beyond what's visible to the naked eye. This is not a person who fills up notebooks and decides to stop when he hits 3. The number 3 was a deliberate choice. What was the choice about? The show suggests the 3-journal system corresponds to 3 phases of Ford's work. The first covers early discoveries, the creatures and phenomena that any explorer arriving in this town would encounter. The second goes deeper into the experimental and the dangerous. The third is the most recent and most comprehensive, written in the years when Ford was building the portal and becoming increasingly aware of how badly things were going. But within those phases, if you read carefully across all 3, the internal timeline doesn't always add up cleanly. There are chronological jumps, periods where Ford appears to have been working for significant stretches without writing anything down, gaps in the record that are not footnoted or explained. that simply appear as white space in the narrative of these years. In a document kept by someone as thorough and systematic as Ford Pines, white space is strange. White space means something. The official Journal 3 tie-in book, the physical book published in July 2016, which contains not only the in-show pages of the journal, but extensive additional material, adds entries for creatures the show never had time to depict. The hide behind, and an entity so unsettling that even Ford's clinical prose seems to strain under the effort of describing it. A creature that is always definitionally just behind you, that preys on the awareness of its own existence, so that the more you think about it, the more real and present it becomes. Ford's notes on the hide behind end, with a recommendation not to linger on this page. There is also a paranormal black market. Ford's journal mentions it. Rumors persist of a paranormal black market, known only to thieving creatures of the night. There are many entrances, but without a key, I've never seen it with my own eyes. He knows it exists. He could not get in. He wrote about it and continued, presumably never finding the key. The creatures of the night who run this market, who they are, what they sell, now how long they have been operating in Gravity Falls without Ford's knowledge, none of this is addressed anywhere in the show or the supplementary materials. Then there is the cave behind the waterfall at Lake Gravity Falls. Ford mentions it in passing, in the kind of notation that means he expected to come back to it and never did. And the floating cliffs, one of the most consistently present visual elements in the show, these impossible stone formations hanging serenely in the air above the tree line, receive a geological origin story in Season 2, when Ford tells Dipper the valley was formed by a crashing spacecraft millions of years ago. But Ford's own journal note on the floating cliffs says something more specific and more troubling than ancient crash site. It reads, "My compass goes haywire the closer I get to them." How does this mean what I think it does? The answer may be underground. His compass goes haywire. He thinks he knows what that means. The answer is underground. Those three things together point at something the spacecraft explanation doesn't fully address. A compass doesn't simply malfunction near the site of an ancient impact. A compass malfunctions near an active magnetic anomaly, near something that is currently, right now, generating a magnetic field powerful enough to interfere with navigation instruments. And the answer being underground means Ford had a specific theory about what was generating that field, a theory he started and didn't finish writing down. What is underneath the floating cliffs of Gravity Falls? What is generating a magnetic field strong enough to make a compass non-functional in the present tense of the show? Ford had a theory and could not or would not write it out fully, and the show never came back to finish the sentence he started. Then there's the monocle. Physical journal. 3 has a small monocle attached to its cover by a short cord. In the expanded Journal 3 book, Ford explains it. His right eye burns with a persistent chronic pain that makes reading with both eyes open difficult. A side effect of Bill having entered his mind. Of possession. Of the specific kind of damage a two-dimensional dream demon does to human neural tissue when it walks through. That monocle is a scar. Physical evidence of the moment Bill got inside Ford's mind, early in their relationship, a wound that has never fully healed. Every entry in those journals was written through that pain. Every observation, every warning, every encrypted margin note to future readers, written by a man with one eye on fire from what had been done to him, continuing to work anyway because the work was more important than the cost. And now those journals are somewhere. At the end of the show, Seuss recovers them after Weirdmageddon, restored. The family briefly considers throwing them into the bottomless pit, a place the show has established sends things somewhere, though nobody knows exactly where. Instead, Dipper keeps them. 3 books carrying 30 years of research, gaps and all, contamination and all, the monocle scar and the burning eye and the white spaces that might be evasion or strategy, or simply the record of a man who ran out of time. In the hands of a boy who now understands what they are, and who is going to spend the rest of his life reading them more carefully than he has ever read anything. There are also specific questions about Journal 2 that the show raises without answering. Gideon Gleeful is a child. He is roughly 10 years old at the start of the show. He has Journal 2. He was able to use it to summon Bill Cipher. Gideon is described as having found Journal 2 somewhere, though the specifics are never clarified. How a 10-year-old child in a small Oregon town came to possess one of Ford's carefully hidden journals. What was in that journal that allowed Gideon to understand enough of its contents to perform an actual summoning ritual? And what else Gideon might have learned from Journal 2 before Stan eventually acquired it? These questions get folded into the broader mystery of the journals without being addressed individually, and they don't become less interesting for that. Section 3. Bill Cipher and the Dimension He Burned. Let's talk about Bill. Not the performance of him, not the jokes and the chaos and the delightfully unsettling energy that makes him one of the best animated villains in the history of children's television. The thing underneath the performance. The thing the axolotl describes in a poem that most people who watch the show never found. The thing the Book of Bill, Alex Hirsch's 2023 tie-in book written from Bill's perspective, carefully and deliberately circles without ever quite landing on directly. The Bill who is a liar, even to himself, especially to himself. Bill Cipher is a two-dimensional, interdimensional dream demon from a destroyed dimension called Euclidia. His age, stated explicitly in the show's cosmology, is over 1 trillion years. 1 trillion years. Take a moment with that number, not as a measurement, but as a metaphor for incomprehensibility. 1 trillion years ago, our sun didn't exist. The Milky Way galaxy was structurally different from what it is now. 1 trillion years ago, nothing that has ever been meaningful to any human being had yet happened. And Bill was there, already himself, already conscious, already making decisions. In the show, Bill presents his ancient age as power, as freedom, as the ultimate expression of his complete immunity to consequence. He has seen so many things end that the ending of any individual thing is meaningless to him. Yet he describes himself in his own Ask Me Anything session on Reddit, which Hirsch conducted in character with Bill answering fan questions, as having been rotten to the core for 1 trillion years at least. He references having had a physical form in a world back when horses were around, placing him in physical reality at least 50 million years ago. He is functionally ancient in a way that exceeds most things the human mind is built to process. And he is also, underneath all of that age and all of that power, and all of that carefully maintained, gleeful chaos, the entity that a cosmic being describes with 6 devastating words. Says he's happy, he's a liar. The poem comes from a supplementary book, Dipper and Mabel and the Curse of the Time Pirate's Treasure, a choose-your-adventure book published in 2016. That in one of the choosable endings, Dipper and Mabel fall out of the normal flow of time and space and encounter the axolotl, an entity whose power the show's cosmology places above even Time Baby and Bill Cipher. The axolotl allows each twin one question. Dipper asks what it knows about Bill Cipher. The answer is a poem. Alex Hirsch confirmed that this book contains a significant canon secret. The poem is the secret. 60 degrees that come in threes. Watches from within birch trees. Saw his own dimension burn. Misses home and can't return. Says he's happy. He's a liar. Blame the arson for the fire. If he wants to shirk the blame, he'll have to invoke my name. One way to absolve his crime. A different form, a different time. 60 degrees that come in threes. An equilateral triangle. All 3 interior angles equal 60 degrees. This is Bill's geometry, his physical description, the mathematical truth of his form. 60 degrees that come in threes, watching from within birch trees, there from the beginning, always watching, embedded in the scenery before the show ever introduces him as a character. Saw his own dimension burn. Misses home and can't return. These 2 lines together change everything about how you understand Bill if you let them. He misses it. His dimension, Euclidia, the 2-dimensional world he came from, is gone. The show establishes and the Book of Bill deepens that he destroyed it. It burned. And he misses it. After however many hundreds of millions of years of operating in the nightmare realm and the mindscape and various other dimensions, constructing elaborate schemes and cultivating relationships and creating chaos wherever he goes. But he still misses a place that has been ash since before the earth was a solid object. Says he's happy. He's a liar. The axolotl is telling you, plainly, that every scene of Bill Cipher's delighted, energetic, joyfully malevolent presence across 2 seasons of the show is a performance. The happiness is constructed. The gleeful chaos is a mask being worn over something much older and much more specific. Somewhere underneath the tie and the bow tie and the theatrical enthusiasm for disorder, there is something that misses where it came from and cannot go back, and has been covering that loss with an increasingly elaborate production for longer than human civilization has existed. Why does this matter? Because a Bill who is performing happiness over an old wound is a genuinely different kind of entity than a Bill who is simply pure malevolent chaos. A purely malevolent being is interesting as a villain, but ultimately limited as a mystery. A being that is covering something, that is masking grief with destruction, that burned its home and has spent eternity pretending it doesn't matter, is a mystery with actual depth to it. It means there was a Bill before the burning. A Bill who existed in a world, however constrained, however wrong for him. A Bill who had parents, who had a place, who made a decision that ended everything and then spent an unimaginable span of time rationalizing it as freedom. The Book of Bill, written from Bill's perspective during his enforced rehabilitation in the theraprism, deepens this considerably. It reveals that when Stan's mind erases Bill at the end of Weirdmageddon, Bill does something he had apparently never tried before. He invokes the axolotl. His final words in the show, played backwards because of course they are XOLOTL. My time has come to burn. I invoke the ancient power that I may return. It is a prayer, a desperate, last-second, completely out-of-character prayer, from an entity that has spent its entire existence insisting it answers to nothing and no one. In the moment of its own ending, Bill Cipher prayed. The axolotl answered, not in the way Bill expected. Instead of restoration, Bill received sentencing. Go through the theraprism, a rehabilitation center that exists outside of space and time, complete the program, face what you've done, and be reincarnated into a new form in a new time. The theraprism requires honesty. It requires sitting with the full weight of what you've done rather than the story you've been telling yourself about it for 1,000,000,000,000 years. It requires, in other words, the one thing Bill Cipher is structurally, fundamentally, constitutionally opposed to doing. The book presents this as comedy, as Bill's worst nightmare, more perfect as a punishment than anything violent could ever be. And it is funny, but underneath the comedy is a genuine engagement with the mystery of what Bill actually is. Because the axolotl's offer of rehabilitation, the possibility of a different form, a different time of genuine transformation, implies that what Bill is may not be fixed. That the entity who burned its dimension and built an elaborate performance over the grief of it could, theoretically, not become something else. Now add to all of this one detail the show drops quietly in the background that very few people have examined carefully. There is an axolotl in a tank in the Mystery Shack's living room. A small, ordinary-looking aquatic salamander sitting in an aquarium among Stan's other trinkets and collectibles. It is there throughout the show. It sits in the background of scenes involving the most profound, supernatural crises in the show's mythology, apparently unbothered. An axolotl, in a tank, in the building that sits directly above the portal Ford built to connect to the Nightmare Realm. Did Ford put it there? Did Stan? Is it the axolotl, the cosmic entity manifesting as a small amphibian in an aquarium? Or is it simply an ordinary aquatic salamander that happens to be the same species as a being of godlike power? Now, the show never addresses this. The creature sits in its tank through every crisis and supernatural event of the entire run, apparently watching, apparently comfortable. That is either nothing or it is everything. And in Gravity Falls, those two options have a remarkable tendency to be the same thing. Let's stay with Bill for a little longer, because I think the full depth of what the show built here still doesn't get examined the way it deserves. The thing that most discussions of Bill Cipher stop at is the question of whether he's coming back. The reversed message at the end of Weirdmageddon, the open door the Book of Bill creates, the theraprism arc, and its intentional ambiguity, all of that becomes the focus. And it's understandable why, because it's a narrative hook, and narrative hooks are easy to grab. But the more interesting mystery, the one that has no answer, because it's a question about the nature of identity rather than about plot mechanics, is this. What was Bill before he burned Euclidia? We know a few things. Euclidia was a two-dimensional dimension, a flat plane of existence, bounded and finite and operating by laws that Bill found intolerable. The Book of Bill, framed as Bill's own account of his life written during his forced rehabilitation, describes Euclidia in terms that are almost nostalgic before the nostalgia is smothered by contempt. There were others like him there, beings of the same geometry, the same native existence. Whatever a society of two-dimensional beings looks like, Euclidia had one. Bill destroyed it. He found a way to perceive the third dimension, to look up, essentially, out from inside a flat plane and see the depth that had always been above and below, but that nothing in his world was equipped to perceive. And the knowledge of what was up there, of what existed beyond the boundaries of the dimension he had been born into, destroyed any tolerance he had for remaining within those boundaries. The book describes this as an awakening, as the natural consequence of intelligence encountering its constraints and refusing to accept them. Bill tells it as a story of liberation. He burned his prison and he left. But the axolotl says, misses home and can't return. And blame the arson for the fire, blame the arson for the fire. These 5 words are doing enormous philosophical work in a very small space. You started the fire. You can't blame the fire for burning what you set alight. Like, you can't look at the ash of your own home and position yourself as the victim of combustion when the match was in your hand, and yet he misses it. He misses the thing he destroyed. He misses the very constraint he found so intolerable that he ended a dimension to escape it. What does this tell us about Bill's trillion years of chaos? It tells us that nothing he has done since burning Euclidia has actually resolved the thing that drove him to burn it. The nightmare realm, the mindscape, the endless parade of civilizations and dimensions he has manipulated and tormented and occasionally just casually destroyed. None of it filled whatever was missing after Euclidia burned. You don't miss something for a trillion years unless the thing you replaced it with was never actually a substitute. So you don't keep running unless what you're running from is still somewhere behind you, keeping pace. The Bill Cipher who shows up in Gravity Falls is not running towards something. He's running away from something. And the Nightmare Realm, his home for longer than the Earth has been solid ground, is not a home any more than a fallout shelter is a home. It's where you wait. It's where you survive. It's not the place that shaped you into what you are, and it's not the place you see when you close your eyes at whatever passes for night in an interdimensional dream space. Euclidia is that place. Was that place. And now here is the most uncomfortable implication of all of this, the one that the Theraprism arc in the Book of Bill circles most carefully. Bill's entire drive to tear down the walls between the mindscape and physical reality, his obsession with making the nightmare realm bleed through into the material world, his years of careful manipulation to get Ford to build the portal, and his ferocious energy during Weirdmageddon, trying to tear the dimensional barriers open permanently. All of that was, on some level, the project of a being that still believes, after a trillion years of evidence to the contrary, that if it just keeps breaking things open, eventually the space will be big enough. Eventually the dimension won't feel like a cage. Eventually something will feel like Euclidia did, in whatever brief time before the burning when Bill still lived there as a native rather than as a refugee from his own choice. It won't. It never will. And the axolotl knows this, and the Theraprism is designed specifically to make Bill know this, and whether Bill is actually capable of integrating that knowledge, of sitting with the reality that what was lost is lost, and that destroying more things does not recreate what was lost, is the question the show leaves open. Because it is the question that has no satisfying narrative answer. It only has a human answer, which is the answer that every person who has ever tried to outrun something irreversible eventually has to confront. You stop running not when you've outrun it, but when you've decided to stop pretending that running works. Section 4, The Blind Eye Society, The Depth of the Forgetting. There is a symbol that appears in the background of Gravity Falls episodes from very early in the show's run. An eye inside a circle, the eye crossed out with an X. It shows up on walls, on signs, and in places you would not look unless you were specifically looking. It sits in the visual background of scenes that have nothing apparently to do with it. And it sits there, episode after episode, months of broadcast time passing, the narrative moving through entirely different storylines, and the symbol is just there, patient as an old mark on a wall, waiting for you to finally ask what it means. It belongs to the Society of the Blind Eye, and it was placed in the show at least a year before the society itself was ever introduced or named. By the time Season 2's seventh episode pulls back the curtain on the society, that symbol has been hiding in plain sight for over a year of real-world broadcast time. It is right there in scene after scene, waiting. The show was teaching you to notice before it taught you what you were noticing. Here's the history of the Blind Eye Society, as the show and its surrounding materials establish it. Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, known in the present day of the show as Old Man McGucket, the town kook who lives at the junkyard and speaks in fragments and makes pronouncements that sound like nonsense and occasionally are, but just as occasionally are something else entirely, was not always the person you see in those scenes. Once, he was a brilliant young engineer from Palo Alto who ran a successful personal computer business under the name Fiddleford Computer Majigs. He attended Backup-Smore University, where he befriended an equally brilliant doctoral candidate named Ford Pines. He was the mechanical genius that Ford needed to build the portal, the specific kind of engineering intelligence that could translate Ford's theoretical framework into physical reality. They worked together for years. And then, on January 18th, 1983, during the first trial of the portal, the rope connecting the test dummy to this side of the portal became tangled with Fiddleford, and for a few seconds, only a few seconds, Fiddleford McGucket was partially submerged in the nightmare realm. He came back. His body came back whole. But in those seconds, his eyes had seen something. The nightmare realm as it actually is, not described, not theorized, not imagined, but directly perceived, the full sensory reality of a dimension that operates by rules incompatible with human consciousness. And what he had seen followed him. Yet it attached itself to his waking mind and his dreams and his most unguarded moments of quiet. His first words upon return constituted a prophecy, delivered while still disoriented. "Beware the beast with just one eye." Bill Cipher, watching from the other side of the portal, and Fiddleford briefly had seen him there. Fiddleford left the project immediately. He told Ford he didn't want to continue, that there was something wrong about the whole enterprise. Ford refused to stop, and so Fiddleford left, carrying the images from those few seconds in the portal doorway, images that followed him everywhere and made ordinary life feel thin and wrong by comparison. So he built a device, a memory gun, a small handheld tool that could isolate a specific memory and extract it, drawing it out of the neural network where it lived, and containing it in a small physical capsule. He tested it on himself first. He extracted the memories of the portal, of the nightmare realm, of the glimpse of something vast and wrong on the other side of that machine. It worked. The pain went away. The images stopped. For the first time since the trial, he slept without dreaming of what he had seen, and then he used it again because erasing those memories left behind a general unease, a sense that something had happened he couldn't quite identify. So he erased a little more, and then a little more. Each time he erased, there was slightly more he needed to erase. A grief spiral made of neuroscience. Within 17 days of quitting Ford's project, Fiddleford founded the Blind Eye Society. His logic, at least in the beginning, was compassionate. Gravity Falls was a town full of supernatural events, gnome attacks, creature sightings, impossible phenomena of every description. The townspeople were aware of these things and frightened by them, existentially disturbed by the constant implication that reality didn't work the way they'd been told. Fiddleford offered them relief. His device could take away the specific memories that troubled them, leave them living in comfortable ignorance while the weirdness continued at a respectful distance. The motto the society adopted was Latin, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. For a small group of people operating out of a hidden room beneath the Museum of Natural History in a small Oregon town, this grandiosity suggests that whoever eventually took over leadership, Blind Ivan, but who ran the society by the time the show reaches the present, had developed a rather inflated sense of their own mission. Because by the present day of the show, the society had moved well beyond compassionate memory management. Under Ivan's leadership, It had become an instrument of comfort taken to its catastrophic extreme. Members used the device not just to help townspeople cope with supernatural encounters, but to erase their own personal inconveniences. Gideon's father, Bud Gleeful, erased the memories of his son's tantrums. Farmer Sprott erased his fear of witches. The reporter Toby Determined erased every rejection from the journalist he was pursuing. A local man who had married a woodpecker on Pioneer Day, a detail the show drops with perfect casual confidence, is also a member. Though what specific memories he needed erased is left to the imagination. These are ordinary people, not villains in any traditional sense, just people who discovered that forgetting was an option and found it impossible to stop using. Blind Ivan is more calculating than the others, more deliberate about using the device as a tool of institutional control, but even he is operating from a recognizable and deeply human impulse, the desire not to be disturbed by things that disturb you, taken to its logical and catastrophic conclusion. Blind Ivan confirms this explicitly when Dipper and his friends are captured and about to have their memories erased. He admits that maybe he feels guilty about what the society does to people like McGucket, and then he uses the memory gun on himself to make that guilt go away. He has built an institution that allows him to continuously erase the consequences of his own conscience. He will never have to feel bad about anything for longer than it takes to point a device at his own head. The Hall of the Forgotten is the physical record of what the society accomplished. A room beneath the museum where extracted memories are stored in small cylindrical capsules, labeled, organized. Thousands of them, representing decades of the townspeople of Gravity Falls, living with the deliberately created illusion that their town is normal, that the things they've seen either didn't happen or don't matter. This is an enormous act of harm dressed in the costume of kindness. Because memory is not simply a recording system. Memory is the fundamental substrate of identity. It is how we build the ability to recognize patterns, to understand cause and effect, to protect ourselves and our communities. When you strip away a memory, you don't just remove an event, you remove everything that would have been built on top of that event. The wisdom that comes from having survived something strange. The instincts that come from having learned something the hard way. The people of Gravity Falls have been, in the deepest sense, kept from growing up. They've been living in a town that has been doing extraordinary things to them for decades, and then having those things surgically removed from their consciousness before they could fully process them. They've been kept perpetually naive about the reality they are living in by a well-meaning genius who lost his way, and then by a small cult of ordinary people who discovered they could use science to avoid ever having to feel uncomfortable again. There is one specific canister in the Hall of the Forgotten that was noticed by close observers of the episode and never explained. It is labeled Jeffrey Canuck. The canister sits in a position of apparent significance within the hall, near the canisters of McGucket and Preston Northwest, the two figures whose memories represent the most significant and dangerous things the society knew about. Jeffrey Canuck is not a character who appears anywhere else in the show, in the journals, or in any supplementary material. The name exists once in a single frame in a single location and is never referred to again. Who is Jeffrey Canuck? What did he see or know or do that placed his extracted memories in proximity to the society's founder and the richest man in town? Was he another witness to something connected to the portal? Someone who encountered Bill Cipher before Ford did? Someone who knew something about the Northwest family's history that the society needed contained? The show doesn't say. The detail was placed with intention. Nothing in Gravity Falls production was accidental. And then the narrative moved on. And Jeffrey Canuck remains a name in a tube in a room underground, a specific kind of Gravity Falls mystery. A puzzle piece that is clearly part of a picture but that the picture never shows you where to put. There is one more layer of the Blind Eye Society's story that the show doesn't have room to fully unpack but that the supplementary materials make clear. Like when Dipper uses the Society's own memory gun to erase the memories of the Society's members in the episode's climax, he restores McGucket's memories, who die, or attempts to. What McGucket gets back is not a clean restoration. He gets back decades of extracted memories in a single overwhelming flood. Every horrible thing he saw, every terrible decision he made, every quiet moment of shame that he'd been systematically removing for 30-plus years, all of it comes back at once, without context, without the gradual processing that normal memory allows. Think about what that experience actually is. Not the cinematic version where a person gasps and tears up and a beautiful score swells. The real cognitive and psychological experience of having decades of suppressed memory return simultaneously. Not one trauma, not one difficult truth, but the full catalog of a life's worth of things that were deemed too painful to keep, returned at full volume, all at once, with no warning and no preparation. That is not healing. That is a different kind of damage. And McGucket, to his credit, makes something of it. The show gives him a relatively positive arc through the rest of the series, reconnecting with his estranged son Tate in the finale montage. But the road between the memory gun moment and that reconciliation is not shown, and it was not a smooth one. The Society of the Blind Eye is ultimately a story about the seductive logic of protective forgetting, and how that logic scales from individual kindness to institutional harm. It starts with a man trying to help people who are genuinely frightened, and it ends with a man using a memory-erasing device on himself to avoid feeling guilty about using a memory-erasing device on himself. There is a direct line between those two things, and it runs through every small decision where someone chose the comfort of not knowing over the discomfort of knowing. And every time that choice was made, it made the next one a little easier, until the choice was no longer experienced as a choice at all, but as simply the natural state of things. Section 5. The Zodiac Wheel. The prophecy that shattered on a grammar correction. You have seen the wheel. Even if you only watched the show once, even if the credits ran during the first episode and you barely registered them, you saw it. It's there at the end of every opening sequence, a brief strobing image that appears for less than a second. A circle. 10 symbols arranged around its outer rim. At the center, a triangle with a single eye, a pine tree, a shooting star, a question mark, a pair of glasses, a llama, a six-fingered hand, an ice bag, a crescent, a bleeding heart, a pentagram. 10 symbols surrounding the image of the demon that the whole show is building toward. And embedded in the decorative text around the wheel, for anyone patient enough to decode a Caesar cipher in the time the credits took to finish, the message: Stan is not what he seems. Most people see this as the show's logo, a visual identity element, an atmospheric flourish. And it is those things, but it is also, from the very first episode, the complete description of the show's finale. Every character who matters in the last battle against Bill Cipher is represented on that wheel, in that opening image, i.e. before any of them have been introduced, before any of them have any narrative significance, before the show has even bothered to explain what the wheel is or why it matters. Ford tells us in the finale what it means. Standing in the Mystery Shack, surrounded by the people who will make their stand against Bill, spray painting the wheel's design on the concrete floor with the urgency of someone who has been waiting to do this for a very long time, he explains. This is an ancient prophecy, left by the people who lived in the Gravity Falls Valley before any modern settlement. These people knew Bill. They had encountered him. We see their cave paintings in the finale. And they had developed a method to stop him. The Zodiac Wheel is that method. 10 individuals, each corresponding to a symbol, some standing together in the circle and joining hands, forming a human energy circuit. If the circle is unbroken, the combined force is sufficient to destroy Bill Cipher permanently. The catch, which Ford emphasizes with the gravity of someone who has been worrying about this specific problem for a long time, the circle cannot be broken. If anyone lets go, the power disperses instantly. The prophecy requires complete, unbroken unity among 10 people who have all, to varying degrees, been shaped by conflict with each other and with themselves. The show is doing something with this structure that is worth examining carefully. The Zodiac appears to be the show's Deus Ex Machina, the ancient prophecy that will allow the good guys to win in a satisfying way. You watch the characters take their positions, you see the energy beginning to build. You feel the satisfaction of the puzzle pieces locking together. All these people who have been developed and tested across 2 seasons, all of them finding their place in a design that was always meant to hold them. It's beautiful. It feels inevitable. And then Ford corrects Stan's grammar. And Stan drops Ford's hand, and the circle breaks. The battle had to be won by a different method, one that nobody expected, one that cost more than any of them imagined possible, one that was not in any journal or any prophecy. It had to be won by Stan walking into a machine that would erase his mind, carrying Bill with him into the void, sacrificing himself so completely that there was simply nothing left for Bill to hold on to. But here is the question the show raises with its Zodiac mechanics and then quietly sidesteps. The ancient peoples of the valley used the Zodiac successfully once before. We know this. Bill was defeated by this method in the distant past and sent back to the nightmare realm. The cave paintings tell us so. The town's history includes a period when the valley was occupied and then abandoned after an encounter with something terrible, and the abandonment was preceded by a victory rather than a defeat. The Zodiac worked. Bill was gone. And then he came back. 1,000 years later, or more, he found his way back to this location and found Ford and built the portal and orchestrated Weirdmageddon. So, what does the Zodiac actually accomplish? If the ancient peoples used it and Bill still returned, then the Zodiac is not a permanent solution. And it is a banishment, not a destruction. It sends Bill back to the nightmare realm rather than erasing him from existence. Which means that even if the Zodiac had worked in the finale, even if Stan and Ford hadn't bickered and the circle had held and the energy had built to its full potential, Bill would have been removed from this particular battle, but not from existence. He would have been back eventually. And here's the question about the Zodiac's origin that the show raises and never answers. Someone designed those symbols. Someone looked at this specific group of 10 people and recognized that these individuals, with these qualities, were the ones the prophecy required. A Pacifica Northwest woman who has never done anything heroic in her life before the episode where she opens the gates, corresponds to the llama because of a wool sweater that Mabel knitted and gave her. The prophecy accounts for a wool garment made by a 12-year-old girl who wouldn't exist for centuries. How? Because someone who existed outside of time designed it. Someone who could look at a possible future and select the specific individuals who would be there, identify the symbols that would connect them, and encode the whole structure in a cave painting, and trust that the pieces would eventually fall into place. The axolotl, watching from within birch trees, planning things on a timescale that makes everything else in the show look like a quick sketch. Alex Hirsch has never explicitly confirmed or denied this reading. But he put an axolotl in a tank in the Mystery Shack. He made Bill invoke the axolotl at the moment of his death. He designed a prophecy that required exactly 10 people who would be naturally present in Gravity Falls during the summer of a particular year. Make of that what you will, at whatever hour you are reading this. But let's sit a little longer with the specific texture of how the Zodiac fails. Because the way it fails is one of the most carefully constructed moments in the show's entire run, and it's worth the extra time. Ford corrects Stan's grammar. That's the whole mechanism. Two brothers who have been estranged for 30 years, who have barely been in the same room together, long enough to remember how to function alongside each other, who have an enormous unresolved grief between them that neither of them is emotionally equipped to process in the middle of a battle to save the world. One of them says something slightly wrong, and the other one can't stop himself from correcting it. The reflex is so automatic that Ford doesn't even appear to clock that it's happening. He just hears the grammatical error and responds to it the way he always responds to imprecision. And Stan, who has 30 years of defensive pride built up around everything his brother thinks of him, drops the hand he was holding. The Zodiac fails not because the people in it aren't brave enough, not because they haven't suffered enough or sacrificed enough, not because the ancient magic isn't real. It fails because two people who love each other haven't yet finished the specific and difficult work of learning how to be in the same room without triggering each other's deepest wounds. It fails for the most human reason imaginable. And the show is not punishing them for this. It's doing something more subtle and more honest. It's saying that some things cannot be fixed by being in the right place at the right time with the right ancient prophecy. Some things require the long, slow, patient work of actually understanding each other, and that work takes time that a Weirdmageddon battle does not provide. Which is why the solution that works is not the Zodiac. The solution that works is Stan. Not Stan standing in a circle of 10 people channeling ancient power. Stan alone, sitting across from Bill in the theater of his own mind. The only weapons available to him being his personality, his grief, his love for his family, and 30 years of stubbornness that turns out to be exactly calibrated for this particular moment. No prophecy prepared for that. No ancient cave painting accounted for it. It was not in any journal. It was just a man who had spent 30 years being wrong about a lot of things, but right about one thing, and that one thing being exactly enough. The Zodiac is a beautiful idea about how unity defeats chaos. The show's actual ending is about something more complicated, about how sometimes the thing that saves you isn't the beautiful idea, but the specific messy person standing in front of you who has made all the wrong choices except the one that mattered. And somewhere in the logic of all of this, the axolotl was watching, that having designed a prophecy that it knew would fail, having planned an ending that could only be reached by failing, having built into the structure of the whole thing a back door that could only open from the inside, by a specific kind of person who could only become that person by living exactly the life Stanford and Stanley Pines had lived. Section 6, The Shapeshifter. An egg with no mother and a warning. Nobody took. In Ford Pine's underground bunker, during the excavation work he and Fiddleford McGucket were doing to extend the laboratory's footprint into the surrounding earth, Ford found an egg. Just an egg. Buried in the soil, not particularly deep, unremarkable in surface texture, except for a quality that Ford found difficult to describe in his notes. Something about the way it sat in the earth. Something about how the dirt around it seemed to have arranged itself around the object rather than simply surrounding it. As though the egg had been there long enough that the ground had learned to accommodate it. He brought it inside, he documented it. He kept it warm and waited. It hatched into what he would officially designate as Experiment 210 and privately call Shifty. The creature that emerged had no stable form. Its default state was a pale, slightly luminous mass of shifting flesh, with a rough suggestion of limbs and features that rearranged themselves constantly in small exploratory adjustments. Within days, it had learned to communicate by transforming, becoming a dog when happy, a sea urchin to express sadness, something resembling a large, angry bird when frustrated. Ford, who had planned to use it purely as a test subject for the bunker's cryogenic chambers, found himself genuinely fond of it. He named it Shifty. He kept it in a cage and fed it canned beans from Fiddleford's enormous stockpile of barren num-nums, high-flying beans, a brand whose mascot would later become the shapeshifter's chosen disguise when encountering Dipper and Wendy, suggesting the creature chose that specific form, not randomly but from memory, from the image most deeply associated with early care and feeding. Fiddleford was uncomfortable with the creature from the beginning. He recommended immediate cryogenic stasis as the safest approach to an organism of unknown origin and unknown capabilities. Ford disagreed and kept studying it, and the study seemed to be going well. Ford developed what reads as genuine affection for Shifty, despite always wearing a surgical mask during interactions, despite never showing the creature images of anything large or predatory. The escalation came from a direction Ford should have anticipated. The shapeshifter wanted more. More forms, more complexity, more scope for what it could become. It observed that Ford was withholding information, specifically the contents of his journals, the catalog of creatures he'd documented across years of research. And it decided to take what it wanted. It impersonated McGucket to trick Ford into handing over a journal. The deception was discovered before the creature could get far with it. The confrontation resulted in Shifty being forced toward the cryogenic tube, and Ford and McGucket sealed the bunker. That's the story as Ford tells it. But when Dipper and Wendy find the bunker in Season 2, now the cryogenic tube that was supposed to contain Shifty has been broken open from the inside. The creature has been free for some period of time, weeks, months, possibly years, contained within the bunker only because Ford and McGucket sealed the exit so thoroughly that even a consciousness able to take any form couldn't find a way through. It has been alone underground, in a sealed facility, in the dark, with access only to whatever it could find within the bunker's walls and whatever it could remember of the forms it had already absorbed. What does that do to a consciousness? An entity whose entire mode of being is continuous transformation, whose sense of identity is inseparable from the act of becoming. What happens to it in total isolation, unable to encounter new things to become? The show doesn't address this because the show doesn't need to for its immediate purposes. But the question is there, and it is not a small one. The shapeshifter functions in the episode as a threat and as a prophet. It is scary, and it is effective, and it delivers its warning to Dipper as it goes back into the tube. Stop asking questions, or you will end up in a fate worse than you can imagine. And then it takes Dipper's form, screaming, and holds that form as the cryogenic process completes. As if mocking the future it claims to have already seen. That prophecy partially comes true. In Northwest Mansion Mystery, the lumberjack ghost turns Dipper into wood. His body is frozen in exactly the form the shapeshifter took. Arms raised, mouth open, the specific posture of someone caught in the moment of maximum fear. And the last form Dipper will ever take, exactly as Shifty promised. Just not permanently, because Pacifica opens the gates and the curse lifts and Dipper is restored. But the foundational question the show explicitly raises and then explicitly declines to answer: where did the egg come from? Ford never identifies a parent organism. He never finds evidence of a breeding population in Gravity Falls or in any dimension his research gave him access to. The egg was simply there, underground, as though it had always been there, or as though it had been placed there, deliberately, waiting for someone with Ford's specific profile to find it. An egg that would hatch into an entity capable of becoming any form it encountered. An entity that would eventually absorb every creature in Ford's journals, and thus provide itself with access to every piece of the supernatural ecosystem Ford had documented. The cryptogram on the shapeshifter's page in Journal 3 reads, "Am I me? Is he me?" These are not rhetorical questions. They are the fundamental question of an entity made entirely of the capacity to be other things. What is identity for a consciousness that has no fixed form? What is the shapeshifter when it is not being anything else? And are the forms it takes representations of its mind, or are they its mind? Does becoming a dog shape mean feeling dog happiness? Does becoming a sea urchin shape mean feeling sea urchin sadness? The show plants these questions and moves past them. They don't have answers in the show, in the journals, in any supplementary material. They exist as the interior life of a creature that the narrative used as an episode villain and then left underground in a tube, frozen, dreaming whatever a constantly shifting consciousness dreams about. There is also the matter of the Dipper clones. In Season 1, Dipper creates copies of himself using a copying machine that Ford had apparently modified to replicate living matter. Most clones are destroyed, but two of them. They steal Robbie Valentino's bicycle and escape into the town. They are made of copy paper. They cannot survive rain. They are somewhere in Gravity Falls, in the forests of Oregon, unable to ever go home. In the final credits of Weirdmageddon Part 3, in the montage of characters' fates after Bill's defeat, there is a brief shot of two figures in raincoats in the woods. The show acknowledges that the clones survived. The show never addresses what their lives are, what it means to be a paper copy of a person living indefinitely in the wilderness, unable to call for help, unable to be acknowledged, knowing that the person they were copied from went home without them, and is presumably living a normal life in Piedmont, California. They are still out there, and they know they are paper. And they chose to stay anyway, because what else is there to do? Something about that image deserves more than a quick mention. The show uses the clones primarily as a comic adventure. Dipper trying to get rid of too many copies of himself. The chaos of multiple identical 12-year-olds competing for the same life. The comedy works, but the detail the finale confirms, that two of them survived, that they are living in the woods, is dropped into a montage of heartwarming endings, and then the show moves on and the weight of it just sits there. Because those two clones have Dipper's memories. They remember being Dipper. They remember having a sister, having a home, having a summer that was the best summer of their lives. And they are paper. They cannot go in the rain. They cannot go home without dissolving or being discovered as copies, or simply facing the reality that the person they were made from has a life they cannot participate in. So they live in the woods in raincoats, and they are Dipper in every way except the ways that matter, for actually being allowed to exist. And the show says this with a 2-second credits shot and then ends. Gravity Falls is full of small abandoned tragedies like this. Things that happen in the narrative that are acknowledged and then not dwelled upon because the show is primarily a comedy adventure, and there is always another crisis. But they accumulate. And when you come back to the show as an adult, or when you have been thinking about it for a long time the way we have been tonight, they pile up into something that feels more honest than comfortable, which is its own kind of tribute to the care with which it was made. The shapeshifter is another one of these, an entity that asks its own fundamental question in the show's own handwritten text. Am I me? Is he me? And then gets frozen in a tube wearing the face of the person it tried to warn, and the show never comes back to it. The question stays on the page. The tube stays sealed. The bunker stays underground. And somewhere in that darkness, whatever the shapeshifter is when it is not being anything else is still waiting for an answer that no one has thought to provide. Section 7. The Northwest Conspiracy. A town built on someone else's story. Let's talk about the Northwests. Not just Pacifica and her parents, not just the mansion with its ghost and its locked gates, but the whole architecture of what the Northwest family represents in the mythology of Gravity Falls, the thing they built, the price other people paid for it, and the extraordinary detail that the show drops in a Season 1 episode and then builds 2 seasons of consequence on top of. The Northwest family are the founders of Gravity Falls. And that is the town's official history, the claim that gives them their social prominence and their right to the manor and their annual party that only admits people deemed worthy. Nathaniel Northwest founded the town. The Northwests have been here from the beginning. This place is theirs in a way it isn't anyone else's. Except it isn't true. In Season 1's Episode 18, Irrational Treasure, Dipper and Mabel discover sealed documents in the Library of Secrets beneath the town hall. The documents reveal that the true founder of Gravity Falls was not Nathaniel Northwest but Quentin Tremblay, a man who was the 8th-and-a-half president of the United States, whose tenure in office was so bizarre and so thoroughly unlike anything a government could endorse that the official record has been systematically erased. Nathaniel Northwest was a cover story, a figure invented by the government to replace the memory of Tremblay with something more conventional, more compatible with the official history of American expansion. The Northwests have been trading on a legacy that was fabricated. Not just ethically compromised, not just morally questionable, literally factually false. They are not who they say they are. Their most fundamental claim, the one that underlies every piece of social power they exercise, is a lie that someone in authority decided was more useful than the truth. The show treats this as a comic adventure and moves on from it. The documents go back. The Northwest family's status is not publicly challenged. Pacifica presumably doesn't find out from this episode. The town of Gravity Falls continues to operate under the assumption that the Northwests belong to it in a way that nobody else does. And the full weight of this discovery, what it would mean for the social order of the town if it became public, what it would mean for Pacifica's understanding of herself and her family, is left as ambient background radiation beneath the rest of the show. By the time we reach Northwest Mansion Mystery in Season 2, this backstory has become the foundation of the episode's horror. The ghost haunting the manor is Archibald Corduroy, confirmed in Journal 3 to be an ancestor of Wendy Corduroy, making this haunting a family affair across multiple generations in a way the show only hints at. Archibald was a lumberjack who, 150 years before the events of the show, that was hired by Nathaniel Northwest to build the mansion. The payment offered was a promise. When the work was done, the Northwest would throw an annual party open to the entire town. Compensation in community rather than wages. A promise made to people with no legal mechanism to enforce it. The construction took years. Many workers died. The deforestation of the surrounding hillside contributed to the mudslide that killed Archibald himself. When the mansion was finally complete, the workers arrived at the gates for the party they had been promised. Nathaniel Northwest laughed at them. His wife laughed alongside him. They shut the gates and never opened them. Archibald died in the mudslide that followed, but not before cursing the family. Return in 150 years. If the gates are still closed to the town, blood will run. And the Northwest family knew this curse was active. They wrote it down. They passed it through the generations as a family secret, a piece of institutional knowledge maintained specifically so that each new Northwest would know the curse was coming and could make a decision about whether to finally honor the original promise or find another way to avoid the consequences. Preston Northwest's decision: hire a 12-year-old paranormal investigator who doesn't know what he's walking into, have him trap the ghost, then continue to not open the gate. Pacifica opens the gate herself. against her parents' explicit wishes, against the conditioning of a lifetime of being managed and controlled by a family that treats her as an asset rather than a person. She opens the gate and lets the town in, and the curse lifts and the ghost passes on. It is one of the best character moments in the show. And it raises a question the show doesn't have time to answer. What happens to Pacifica after the episode? Preston carries a small bell. He uses it to condition his daughter into immediate compliance, rings it when she begins to assert any independence, and she instantly shuts down, falls in line, becomes the version of herself her parents want. This is shown once, used with maximum emotional impact, and then not revisited in any sustained way. Pacifica has defied her father once. She has had one significant moment of breaking the pattern. But the conditioning of a lifetime doesn't dissolve in a single act of defiance, and the show's established behavioral dynamics make it very clear that she's going back to that house with those parents afterward. She appears in the finale, in the Weirdmageddon Resistance, wearing Mabel's llama sweater. She has chosen a side, but the mechanics of how she lives the next years of her life, what the bell sounds like after the episode, what version of herself she manages to preserve against the weight of everything she grew up inside. That is a story the show gestures toward without telling. There is also the broader question of what the Northwests knew about the supernatural that goes beyond the ghost. Preston Northwest appears in various places in the town's story. His memories were stored in the Hall of the Forgotten, in a prominent position near the memories of McGucket and alongside whoever Jeffrey Canuck is. What did Preston see or do that required the society's intervention? What does the wealthiest and most socially powerful man in Gravity Falls know about the town that he needed contained in a memory capsule in a room underground? The answer is almost certainly connected to the fact that the Northwest Mansion is not simply an old house on a hill. The Northwest property sits at a specific location in Gravity Falls, a location that was apparently significant enough for Nathaniel Northwest to build his estate there, in a valley already known for supernatural phenomena, at a time when the full extent of those phenomena was presumably already apparent to anyone paying attention. The mansion is a building constructed on contested ground in a contested valley by a family whose entire identity is constructed around a lie. What does the house know? What happened in those rooms across 150 years that never made it into the ghost story the episode tells? The bell that Preston uses on Pacifica. Where did he learn that technique, and who taught it to him? And how many generations of Northwest daughters were managed that way before Pacifica was born? These are not questions about the supernatural exactly. They are questions about a family's internal culture of harm, maintained across generations, justified by the performance of social superiority that requires constant maintenance precisely because it has no real foundation. The Northwests are, in some ways, the show's clearest depiction of institutional generational damage. The harm they do to Pacifica is not extraordinary in the way Bill's harm is extraordinary. It is ordinary. It is the kind of thing that happens in ordinary families with ordinary power dynamics and ordinary cruelties. The bell is a detail from a horror story, but the conditioning it represents is not. The version of that conditioning that doesn't involve a literal bell is everywhere, and Pacifica has to dismantle something that has been built into her over her entire life, which is not a moment's work. She does it in one episode. She does the first step of it, the hardest step, the one that requires acting before you're ready and before you fully understand what you're doing. And then the show ends and she goes back to the mansion and the people who built that conditioning, and whatever happens next happens off screen. In the Gravity Falls that exists after the story the show was willing to tell. Now, that unshown continuation is one of the things I come back to most often. Not the supernatural mysteries, not the egg or the canister or the axolotl in the tank, but Pacifica Northwest, the morning after Weirdmageddon, in the house on the hill, starting the long work of figuring out who she is when nobody with a bell is watching. Section 8. The Time Baby and the Future That Unraveled. Blendon Blandon first appears as comedy. His jumpsuit is too gray, his pockets are too numerous, his job, time paradox avoidance enforcement for the Bureau of Time Travel, is described with the exhaustion of a man who has been doing difficult work for too long without adequate appreciation. He's funny and charming in his way. And he comes from a future that the show gestures at extensively without ever fully depicting. A future with enough stable institutional infrastructure around the preservation of the timeline that entire departments are dedicated to preventing paradox. By the time Weirdmageddon happens, the Time Baby is dead. This is presented in the show primarily as a demonstration of how powerful Bill is during Weirdmageddon. He faces the Time Baby and his forces, who have apparently arrived to stop him, and destroys them all. The Time Baby, whose power was described as operating at a cosmic level, is eliminated. The entire institutional structure around temporal regulation in this universe's future is obliterated in a single encounter. But the implication extends further than a power demonstration. The Time Baby's death is not just Bill removing a threat. It is the removal of the entity responsible for maintaining causal integrity across the timeline. Every temporal paradox that the Bureau of Time Travel was founded to prevent is now unaddressed. Every intervention that Blendon and his colleagues were making to prevent timeline alterations is now unmade. The infrastructure of temporal oversight is gone, and Blendon is still alive, still present, still equipped with his time tools. But the organization that trained him and employed him and gave his life structure is destroyed, and the authority that backed his enforcement of temporal rules has been eliminated. He is a time traveler from a future that may have been altered by the events he just survived, carrying equipment from an institution that may no longer exist, but with no oversight and no restrictions on where or when he can go. The show treats Blendon's survival as a grace note in the finale's montage of character fates. He is shown briefly and apparently positively, but the structural implications of his situation, a free agent time traveler in a universe whose temporal regulatory framework has collapsed, are left entirely ambient. The show also establishes, in the episode introducing Blendon, that the timeline is genuinely alterable. Dipper and Mabel travel back to their own 10th birthday and make a correction to something they accidentally broke. The correction works. They return to the present. Their parents now have a photo from that birthday party that didn't exist before the trip. The past can be changed, and the changes propagate forward through causality into the present, which means that every tragedy in the show's timeline is theoretically correctable. The 30 years Stan spent alone in that shack, the damage Ford suffered through his relationship with Bill, the years that Fiddleford McGucket lost to the memory gun, all of it could, in principle, be undone by someone with the right equipment and the knowledge of where to intervene. And after the Time Baby's death, there is nobody to prevent that kind of intervention. The show also establishes, in the episode introducing Blendon, that the timeline is genuinely alterable. Dipper and Mabel travel back to their own 10th birthday and make a correction to something they accidentally broke. The correction works. They return to the present. Their parents now have a photo from that birthday party that didn't exist before the trip. The past can be changed, and the changes propagate forward through causality into the present, which means that every tragedy in the show's timeline is theoretically correctable. The 30 years Stan spent alone in that shack, the damage Ford suffered through his relationship with Bill, the years that Fiddleford McGucket lost to the memory gun, all of it could, in principle, be undone by someone with the right equipment and the knowledge of where to intervene. And after the Time Baby's death, there is nobody to prevent that kind of intervention. The show doesn't explore this. It ends with its emotional resolution, and the time travel implications remain ambient, present in the mythology without pressing on the narrative's conclusions. But they are there. The universe the show built has a wound in its timeline management. And that wound didn't close when Bill was defeated. There is also the question of the Time Baby's nature that the show never fully addresses. He is enormous, 60 feet tall according to the episode where he appears, and able to destroy anything by looking at it hard enough. He commands an army of time police. He exists in the show's future, which means he was born at some point after the show's present, which means he is somehow a being of both time and matter, in a way that most entities in the show's cosmology are not. He is not supernatural in the way that Bill is supernatural. He is not from another dimension. He is a baby who exists in time's future and commands it. How does a baby command time? What is the Time Baby's origin? Who were his parents? Was he born naturally, somehow, or created? And if created, by whom and for what specific purpose? The Time Baby appears in exactly 3 contexts in the show: the episode about avoiding time paradoxes, the episode about Blendon's vendetta against the twins, and Weirdmageddon, where he dies. In none of those contexts does anyone explain what he actually is or how he came to be the sovereign authority over temporal governance. The show treats him as a given. He exists. He is powerful. He dies. The loss of his power has major structural implications, and none of the fundamental questions about his nature are ever addressed because the show's story never needed those questions answered. He was a world-building element, a piece of the show's cosmological backdrop that made the universe feel bigger and stranger than any individual storyline could account for. But he is gone now, and whatever built him, whatever natural or constructed process resulted in an enormous time-governing infant, the record of that process died with him. Another mystery with no bottom, not because the show was careless with the question, but because some details are window dressing that turns out, under the right examination, to be load-bearing. Section 9. The 30 years Stan carried alone. Let's sit with Stanley Pines for a moment. Not Grunkle Stan, the performance, the fez and the bow tie, and the endless grift, and the jokes that run just long enough to cover whatever he doesn't want you to see underneath them. Stanley Pines, the person inside that performance, the one who was about 19 years old when his father looked at him and said he was a burden who had ruined his brother's life and threw him out. The Pines twins grew up in Glasshard Beach, New Jersey, sons of Philbrick Pines, who ran a pawn shop and had very specific ambitions for his children, and very little patience for those ambitions not being met on schedule. Ford was the genius, the boy with 6 fingers, whose anomalous biology was treated in the Pines household as a mark of destiny. Stan was the other one. Not stupid, not without talent, but not the genius. The one who got by on personality and street sense and a remarkable ability to read people and situations. The fracture happened during Ford's science fair project, a project significant enough to have attracted the attention of a prestigious university. The kind of recognition that would have changed Ford's trajectory significantly if it hadn't been disrupted. Stan broke the project by accident. It cost Ford the scholarship. Philbrick disowned Stan and made him leave, and the Pines family divided. Ford going to backups more, Stan going somewhere, everywhere, nowhere specifically for a long time. The map that briefly appears in A Tale of Two Stans, showing Stan's trajectory across North America during his years between exile and arrival in Gravity Falls, traces a path that includes stops in an enormous number of locations. The show's internal timeline suggests that Stan was in Colombia at some point in the late 1970s, and that his presence there involved enough legal trouble to result in imprisonment. He spent time in a Colombian prison. He made a friend named Rico, the kind of friendship you make when you are trapped somewhere, the kind that involves a debt that carries consequences. He also had a brief marriage. 6 hours? Stan describes it. Set in Las Vegas, ended when the woman he knew as Marilyn took his car and his money and jumped into a canyon. Stan tells this story as comedy, the way he tells everything as comedy, but it is also the story of a man trying to construct a life and having it pulled out from under him repeatedly. And then Ford sent a postcard, not to reconcile. Ford needed help hiding a journal. Ford was already deep in his research, already working with Bill, already feeling the first chill of understanding that something was wrong. He sent for Stan because Stan was the most useful person he knew for moving things discreetly. Not for brotherly love, for logistics. Stan came anyway. Of course Stan came. Because whatever else was true about their relationship, the Stan spent his entire adult life trying to correct the mistake that cost him his brother. They fought. The portal activated by accident, Ford went through it, and Stan was left standing in a basement with an interdimensional machine he'd never seen before, a journal he could barely read, and 30 years of unresolved grief made suddenly acute by the realization that he'd just gotten his brother back and immediately lost him again. He stayed. He took Ford's identity. He faked his own death. He turned his brother's research cabin into a tourist trap and ran it for 30 years as a cover story for the real work happening in the basement, which was studying Ford's journals, teaching himself enough physics and engineering to understand what the portal needed and slowly, methodically, working toward bringing Ford home. And every dollar the Mystery Shack made went toward buying parts, paying bills, keeping the building functional so the portal could keep running. The show doesn't spend much time on what those 30 years actually looked like in their day-to-day texture. It gives us the broad strokes, the mystery shack, the various employees before Suze and Wendy, the rivalry with Gideon that predated the show's timeline. It gives us the older Stan we meet in the first episode, who has clearly settled into something like a functional routine, who has made a kind of peace with his situation, even while never quite giving up on it. It gives us the moment in A Tale of Two Stans where we see young Stan shell-shocked and alone, staring at the portal with no idea how to turn it on. And then we cut to older Stan turning it on with the practiced ease of someone who figured it out long ago. But it doesn't give us the space between those images, the specific shape of 30 years of a person waiting. Of going to bed knowing that somewhere beyond the machine in the basement, there is a dimension your brother is lost in. Of getting up in the morning and running a fake tourist attraction and not dying of loneliness or despair, or the particular kind of slow erosion that happens to people who spend decades carrying a secret that they cannot share with anyone. Stan mentions, in the show's present, that he has been arrested in 48 of the 50 states. Not all of those arrests can predate his time in Gravity Falls. The geography alone makes that implausible. At some point during those 30 years, Stan was leaving Gravity Falls, doing things that resulted in arrest, and returning. What was he doing? Running the scams his father trained him for? Gathering parts for the portal through methods that didn't bear scrutiny? Simply needing occasionally to be somewhere other than that shack, with someone other than nobody, doing something that felt like life rather than maintenance? The show doesn't say. And this is one of the mysteries I find myself most drawn back to, not because it contains supernatural intrigue or connects to the broader cosmology, but because it is simply the story of a human being living an impossible situation for 30 years and what that costs. We see who Stan is at the end of those 30 years. We know something about who he was at the beginning. The middle is a shadow. The finale gives us the resolution, Stan's sacrifice. His memories erased and then slowly returning under the influence of his family's presence, of Waddles the pig, of Mabel's scrapbook. He comes back. He is recovered. And he and Ford sail away on the Stan War II toward new mysteries, toward a version of the future that neither of them expected to have. But the 30 years between exile and return, the 30 years that made Stan into the person capable of that sacrifice, are still mostly dark. And in that darkness, somewhere, is the specific texture of what it means to choose a person over everything else for 30 years without being able to tell them you're doing it. There is something that needs to be said about what Stan's choice actually cost, in practical terms, at the level of daily life. When Ford went through the portal, the accident didn't just take Ford. It took every version of the future Stan had been vaguely building toward. Whatever Stan's ambitions were, and they were never as well defined as Ford's, never anchored to a specific destination the way Ford's genius pointed him like a compass. They required, at minimum, being a person with a real identity in the real world. Stan had to become Ford. He had to give up whatever trajectory his own name carried and take on his brother's. This means every relationship Stan formed from that point forward was formed under a false identity. Every person who thought they knew him knew a performance. Every moment of connection was built on a foundation of necessary deception. He could not have real friends. Not really, because real friendship requires honesty about who you are, and Stan could not be honest about that most basic thing. Yet he had the twins for one summer, and for that summer he was allowed to be a version of himself, gruff and funny and fundamentally caring in the way he'd always been. Even as a kid in Glass Shard Beach when he was running small schemes for his father, and looking out for his twin in the particular sideways way that Stan has always expressed love. He was allowed to be himself for one summer, and the cost of that was the end of the secret he'd kept for 30 years, and the near destruction of the world, and the loss of his own mind. He paid that cost without flinching. When it came to it, when Bill was inside him and the only way out was gone, Stan made the choice in the time it takes to make a choice. Not after deliberation. Not after a speech about what he was giving up. Yet he looked at his family, and he made the calculation that his mind was worth less than theirs, and he did it. The show gives this moment the weight it deserves, but it doesn't spend much time afterward on the question of whether Stan ever fully reckons with what he carried for 30 years. The recovery arc is warm and hopeful and real. Mabel's scrapbook, the pig, The slow return of names and faces, and the threat of himself reappearing from underneath the erasure. And then he and Ford sail away, and it's beautiful. But Stanford Pines is also on that boat, the brother who corrected Stan's grammar in the middle of the battle to save the world. The brother who spent 30 years in another dimension, while Stan spent 30 years alone in a shack. The brother whose first reunion with Stan after 30 years of separation involved Ford threatening Stan with a crossbow, and Stan immediately trying to pretend nothing was wrong. Two people who love each other enormously and have absolutely no practice being in the same room without hurting each other, now living together on a boat with nowhere to go when the old wounds open again. The Stan-O-War 2 is the most complicated happy ending in children's animation. Two brothers, a boat, an ocean, and the unfinished business of a lifetime. The show trusts us to understand that this is not a resolution, but a beginning, that the real work starts when the adventure ends, and the two of them are just two people with a complicated history and nowhere to be except here, together, finally. Section 10. Weirdmageddon's Loose Ends. What didn't get restored? When Weirdmageddon ended, when Stan walked out of the ruins of his own mind having carried Bill Cipher's destruction at the cost of every memory he'd ever formed, the town of Gravity Falls was restored. The pyramid collapsed. The tear in the sky closed. The henchmen were pulled back. The weirdness wave receded. Everything went back to approximately normal. Approximately. The supplementary comic series Gravity Falls. Lost Legends establishes that after Weirdmageddon, random dimensional tiers continue to open across Gravity Falls. Not regularly, not predictably, not at sites that Ford can anticipate, just randomly, odd windows into other dimensions appearing and disappearing throughout the town as residual effects of Bill's presence and the structural damage his reality. Warping did to the dimensional boundaries around the valley. Ford studies them. He maps them. He tries to understand whether they will eventually stop or whether they represent a permanent change to the town's relationship with the broader dimensional landscape. The Lost Legends comics also confirm something about the Blind Eye Society's fate that the episode of the same name left ambiguous. When Dipper turned the memory gun on the Society's members, he erased their memories of their own involvement with the organization. But not every member was present in that room at that moment. Two members who were absent escaped. They still have their memories of the Society, but they still know what the memory gun does and how to use it. And they are shown in the comics operating in Gravity Falls' paranormal black market, the market Ford mentioned in his journals, the one he could never access without a key, selling memory tubes to buyers willing to pay for other people's extracted recollections. The Society isn't gone. Its institution is disbanded. Its leadership is neutered. But the idea of it, the practice of it, the knowledge underlying it, survived in two people with a demonstrated willingness to monetize what they know. And then there is the matter of what Weirdmageddon permanently changed in its people. The show's finale carefully presents the physical restoration of Gravity Falls. Things are returned to their pre-Weirdmageddon states. The petrified townspeople are unpetrified. But the people who were turned into stone and held in Bill's fortress were conscious during their petrification in at least some cases. They experienced whatever it is to be aware while trapped in stone. When they were restored, they came back with that experience intact. It doesn't go away because the physical condition resolved. When Stan's memory is erased and then slowly recovered, the show presents his recovery as essentially complete. Mabel's presence, the scrapbook, the pig, these things pull him back. But memory is not a filing system that can be partially emptied and then refilled from backup. Memory is the substrate of identity, and when a substrate is erased and rebuilt, what grows back is grown from the same soil but not from the same seeds. The Stan who sails away on the Stan-O-War 2 has recovered himself. He is himself. But he is also a version of himself that was destroyed and rebuilt, and whether the rebuilt version contains everything the original did, that question has no clean answer, and the show is wise enough not to pretend it does. Bill Cipher's dying message adds one more layer to Weirdmageddon's unresolved threads. The reversed words, AXOLOTL, my time has come to burn. I invoke the ancient power that I may return, are a door that Hirsch deliberately left open. He has said about that specific detail, that he likes stories that complete their emotional arcs but leave lingering threads, that it gives the fans something to theorize on, that it gives him a window back into that world if he ever chooses to return to it. The emotional arc is complete. The window is open. On the other side of that window is a being in interdimensional therapy, confronting things it has been covering for over 1 trillion years, working toward whatever a different form in a different time means for an entity that burned its home and has been running from the smell of smoke ever since. Section 11. The real Gravity Falls. The mystery that was always a mirror. There are things about Gravity Falls that go deeper than plot. Questions that Hirsch built into the architecture of the show that were not intended to be answered by the narrative because they live in the space between what the show says and what it means. Things the show was doing quietly, constantly, in the background of every episode that have nothing to do with ciphers or creatures or interdimensional portals. And Alex Hirsch was drawing heavily and openly on summer vacations he and his twin sister Ariel took with their grandparents when he conceived the show. His grandfather, whom Hirsch has described in terms that make the emotional DNA of Grunkelstan immediately apparent, was the emotional anchor of those summers. A man whose love expressed itself sideways, in gruffness and jokes and deflection, and the kind of caring that shows up as presence rather than articulation. The Mystery Shack started as a memory of summer, of being somewhere strange and slightly disreputable and completely beloved, of a kind of warmth that didn't need to explain itself. And then the mythology came. The portal. The twin brothers. 30 years of estrangement and secret devotion. F. Ford and his genius and his loneliness, and the way Bill found exactly the shape of that loneliness and built a door in it. McGucket and his device and the organization he founded to help people forget, and the decades he spent forgetting himself. The Northwest and their 150-year-old lie, and the ghost that stood at their gate and demanded justice and got it from the one person in the family who had decided she was going to be different. These stories are not about supernatural phenomena. They are about very specific, very human failures. About what happens when intelligence and loneliness coincide. About what happens when power and privilege get institutionalized across generations, and the people who inherit them never choose to examine what they're inheriting. About what happens when the impulse to protect someone from pain becomes the impulse to take away their ability to experience reality. About what happens when two brothers who love each other can't get through 15 seconds without the weight of 30 years rising to the surface. And the show hides these themes inside genre entertainment with the precision of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The Creature of the Week episodes are not filler. They are the show's method of building the audience's trust before it asks them to sit with something harder. You laugh at the gnomes, you get invested in the summer, you start to love these characters. And then, built on that foundation of investment and trust, the show starts showing you what Stanford Pines looks like when he can't sleep. What McGucket looks like when the memory gun comes for the last time. What Pacifica looks like in the moment she decides she's done being managed. The show earned every one of those moments. It earned them by being funny and delightful and genuinely entertaining for the episodes that preceded them. But the weight of those moments is not incidental to the show's identity. It is the show's identity. The comedy and the mythology are the delivery mechanism for a deeply sincere engagement with the question of what family costs and what it's worth. Hirsch has spoken in interviews about the biographical roots of this, about his own twin sister, and the specificity of what it means to share your entire formative experience with another person, about his grandfather, who died before the show was finished and never got to see what the Grunkelstan arc became. About the way grief works in real life. Not like a clean narrative arc with a satisfying resolution, but like something you keep finding in unexpected places in the middle of ordinary days, years after you thought you'd dealt with it. He put all of that into a children's show. He put it in with care and craft and genuine attention to what children were capable of receiving, and he trusted them to receive more than most children's television credits them with. And they did. And they are still doing it, now that they are not children anymore. Coming back to a cartoon from 2012 as adults with new losses and new complicated relationships and new experience of the specific things the show was always quietly about. Now that is the mystery that has no bottom. Not the egg in the bunker, not the name on the canister, not the reversed message and the open door. The bottomless mystery is the fact that this show found a generation of people at exactly the right developmental moment and gave them a framework for thinking about intelligence and loneliness and family damage and the cost of secrets. And they absorbed it without knowing they were absorbing it. And now it is part of how they understand the world. And they can't fully trace the line between what they know because they lived it and what they know because they spent a summer in a town in Oregon that never existed, at 11 or 12 or 13 years old, watching a cartoon about twins who cared about everything. Bill Cipher is the most interesting mirror the show holds up. Bill is, in the end, a story about a being that felt trapped and burned everything down to escape the trap, and then discovered that what it burned included the only thing it ever missed. The things that constrain you, the relationships, the obligations, the world that makes demands on you just by existing, are also the things that make you something. Take them away and you don't get freedom. You get Euclidia, you get ash and the smell of smoke and an enormous open space where something used to be. The show was teaching this to children who were 12 years old and watching a funny cartoon about twins solving mysteries. Not through allegory, not through preaching, but through characters who were vivid and funny and strange, and who carried their damage the way real people carry damage, not as a lesson, but as a fact about themselves that had to be reckoned with over time. That is why Gravity Falls has the half-life that it does, why people who watched it at 12 are finding new things in it at 25, at 30, not because the show changed, it's the same 40 episodes it always was. What changed is you. What you know about loneliness, about manipulation, about the cost of keeping secrets, about what families do to each other when they're afraid. All of that grows over years of living, and every time it grows, you bring it back to the show, and the show has something to say about it. Bill was always charming because charm is how manipulation works. You don't recognize it as a threat until it's already inside my mind. Stanford Pines was brilliant and lonely and desperate to be understood, and Bill saw all three of those things and built his entire approach around them. For 6 years, Ford thought he had a collaborator, a friend, an equal. And then Bill showed him the truth, and everything that had felt like discovery revealed itself as architecture for someone else's plan. The mystery of Gravity Falls, when you strip everything else away, is the question of whether you can come back from that. Whether a man who spent 6 years of his life being subtly shaped by an intelligence that wanted to use him can recognize what was done to him, integrate it, and choose differently going forward. The show says yes. Stan's sacrifice says yes. Ford's long, difficult road back to his brother says yes. But it also shows you the gyatba. It shows you that yes has a price and the price is high, and sometimes you pay it anyway because there are things worth paying it for. And that specific thing is what a generation of children absorbed from a cartoon about a town in Oregon without necessarily knowing they were absorbing it and are still carrying now. Section 12. The mystery that has no bottom. And why that is exactly right. Great mysteries last because the question they are asking is the kind that reality itself doesn't have a clean answer for. Who burned Euclidia? Bill did. Why? Because he felt trapped. Why did he feel trapped? Because he was a consciousness too large for the space it had been given. And what do you do with a consciousness that burns everything down because the world it was born into wasn't big enough? You put it in a room and you ask it to sit with itself. You take away the top hat and the cane and the charming chaos, and you say, this is what you are when nobody is watching. What do you want to be instead? That is the mystery with no bottom. Not what Bill is or where he came from or whether he'll return in a different form at a different time. The mystery is whether change is possible for something that has been the same thing for over 1 trillion years. Whether a being built from the decision to destroy can build anything instead. The axolotl thinks it can. The theraprism is predicated on the belief that it can. And whether that belief is well-founded or naive is something nobody, not the show, not the Book of Bill, not Hirsch himself in any interview, has definitively answered. The show gave us a small axolotl in a tank and hoped we'd look it up. The show gave us a reversed message in the finale and hoped we'd play it backwards. The show gave us a poem from a godlike creature in a supplementary book and called it a canon secret and hoped the right people would find it and understand what they were reading. Those are invitations. Invitations to keep going, to keep looking, to be the kind of person who plays audio files backwards at 1 in the morning. Not because you expect to find something definitively provable, but because the act of looking carefully at things is its own reward. Gravity Falls built a generation of people who know how to look carefully at things, who know that layers exist, who know that what appears on the surface is never the whole story, who know that the answer is sometimes in the question, and the key is sometimes in the song, and the warning is sometimes in the thing you watch every single week without really seeing it. We have spent a long time in here tonight, hours really, if you have been with me from the beginning. And I want to say thank you for that, genuinely, not as a formality, but because spending time this way, sitting carefully with something that deserves care, is not the default mode of how most things get consumed. You chose to slow down, to stay with it, to let the questions breathe. That's the same choice Dipper made when he opened the journal. That's the same choice that started everything. If you've made it this far, I hope at least one thing we talked about tonight is going to stay with you. In the back of your mind, in the way things stay with you at this hour, Jeffrey Canuck's canister in the Hall of the Forgotten, and all the questions his name carries. The egg that came from nowhere and hatched something that became dangerous precisely because someone treated it as a pet. The trillion-year grief wearing the costume of chaos, the burning home that Bill can't stop missing even while pretending, with every ounce of theatrical energy at his disposal, that he never had a home worth missing. Or maybe just the image of two Dipper clones in rain ponchos, alive in the Oregon woods, unable to ever go home, wearing the coats they found and choosing to stay anyway, because what else is there to do? Some things you can't unknow. The best mysteries are like that. The forest around Gravity Falls is still there. The floating cliffs are still floating. The journals are wherever they ended up after the bottomless pit decided what to do with them, while the two remaining Blind Eye members are out there selling memories. The shapeshifter is in its tube underground, frozen, dreaming. The axolotl exists in the space outside space, vast as a nebula, still watching. And at Confusion Hill in Piercy, California, a roadside tourist attraction that is itself the real-world inspiration for the Mystery Shack, the first building that inspired the design of the show's central location. There's a plexiglass triangle with one eye, standing in the ground, growing moss. The Bill Cipher statue, placed there after the Cipher hunt of 2016, found it in Reedsport, Oregon, and a series of property disputes moved it to its permanent home. Bill made it to the real world after all. Not as a dream demon, not as a cosmic horror, but as a prop with seeds rubbed into it, growing things, just standing in the California woods. He watches from the trees. He's been there the whole time. Before you go, if you've been watching from the beginning, and this is the kind of content that works for you, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely keeps this channel alive and this community growing. And the community is worth growing. Drop a comment with the Gravity Falls mystery that still bothers you most. The one you can't put down. The one you went back to after the show ended and turned over and over and couldn't find a clean edge on. I want to know what it is. I'll be reading. Good night. Stay curious. Stay strange. The woods will still be there tomorrow, and the questions will still be waiting, patient as old trees holding everything they know. We'll meet again.